We are running a bit behind time. Bettina Arndt is our next speaker. I'm not going to try to give you all the details of her life and achievements. Most of you know her very well, but she, as you know, continues to carry out courageous work, performing a respected role as a respected media commentator and a passionate advocate for issues affecting men under siege at the moment. After working for many years as a sex therapist, she became increasingly concerned about what was happening to men and the erosion of free speech, and she spent the last 3 decades speaking out about the unfair treatment of men under siege, as well as continuing her campaign on broader gender and social issues. In 2020, Bettina received the Order of Australia for her work performing gender equity through advocacy for men, an award which promoted a ferocious but ultimately unsuccessful campaign by some to have her award cancelled. I think it only served to stiffen Bettina's resolve to continue her good work, which we're all very grateful for. So, ladies and gentlemen, could I ask you please to welcome and applaud Bettina Arndt.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Vanessa. That was an extraordinary time to hear your story and Craig's story. Thank you all for coming today. It's been quite a business pulling this whole thing together. Anyway, we're here, and it's a very exciting time for me. I want to start by talking briefly about my early career, because it makes me so sad that I started off with this joyous career talking about helping women enjoy sex. I'd done research on female orgasm. I'd spent 10 years out there trying to teach people to make sex a joyful, normal part of life. And I had such fun. I'll just tell you one quick story. I used to have a talkback radio show, and one day I was talking about female ejaculation. And so this was something that just hit the news, and I encouraged people to ring in and tell me all about it. And a woman rang up and said, "Oh, look, when this, don't tell Bettina, I don't want to go on air, but when this happens to me, my vagina doesn't matter, and it spurts," and went into this long explanation. And suddenly she heard a voice saying, "And whom do you think you're speaking to?" She had a wrong number. And she picked herself up off the floor and rang us back half an hour later. I was once known for having audiences rolling in the aisles, and now I scare the pants off them when I talk about what's happening to sex. And I think that's really tragic. Sex has become such a battleground. We're absolutely weaponized against men. Women are taught to see themselves victims, cowering from dangerous men. In New South Wales at the moment, the sex most people have most of the time is now illegal. We have affirmative consent laws, which means that if you've been married for 20 years, it is illegal for you to make love to your wife without checking every inch of the way for affirmative consent. Can I nibble your ear, dear? May I pull down your trousers? We don't do that in our normal relationship. And yet zealots have marched into our bedrooms wearing jackboots and declared that is how we should behave. What we're seeing in Australia now, sexual consent is being taught in all our schools, teaching girls that boys are all potential predators. And as a result of that, we've seen a huge spike in sexual assault cases flooding into our courts. And the trouble is, some of these courses are getting it wrong. Take the issue of drunk sex, intoxicated sex. If you've been drinking and you can't remember having sex, that doesn't mean you've been raped. And yet that's exactly what's being taught in some of these consent courses and by our media. That's not what our courts are deciding. Last year, 6 New South Wales District Court judges spoke out about sexual assault cases in court being supported by unsatisfactory evidence, and that's led to an audit of all sexual assault cases. Now, 2 of those cases that the judges were talking about referred to women who drank so much they couldn't remember what happened. And toxicology experts were brought into court who proved that people are perfectly capable of having blackouts. They can be in a situation where they're drunk and they can't remember what happened. But at the time, they were behaving perfectly normally, interacting with people and able to give consent. And that's what the judges... so the judges based their decisions on this evidence and said those cases should never have ended up in court. The classic was this case called Martinez, where the complainant had 9 times got totally pissed and had sex with different men, and then went to the police and complained that she couldn't remember what happened and therefore she must have been raped. And the amazing thing is, in New South Wales, you're not allowed to give evidence of a previous history of false allegations, as one of the judges pointed out. I mean, this is total madness. Think about what happens to a man who's been accused of this sort of a crime. He's publicly named and shamed. They lose their careers, their reputations, their friends. Their families often spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to defend these cases. We've got people in this room today whose loved ones have been through this sort of dreadful ordeal or who've been through it themselves. And every week I hear from dozens of these people and it breaks my heart. We're in the grip of a moral panic, an orchestrated campaign to create hysteria about women not being safe. And it's absolutely a feminist campaign. It's part of a long-running attack on male sexuality. The 19th century suffragettes had a slogan, "Votes for women, chastity for men." I mean, think about that craziness. I know that some people object to me blaming feminism, and I know there are still feminists out there who believe in fair treatment for men and women. But the anti-male activists who control all our institutions also call themselves feminists, and they are using laws and regulations to target men. And I believe we have to name the enemy and talk about who they are and what is the ideology that's pushing them. The notion that women aren't safe in Australia is utter nonsense. We live in one of the safest countries in the world for women. Violence against women has been going down for many years. Rape is treated... Can someone get me a glass of water? Rape is treated very seriously in our justice system, as it should be. It attracts some of the highest sentences of all crimes and has one of the highest conviction rates of all other crimes. Thank you, my darling. Almost all... So that wasn't always the case. Obviously, there was a need for reform to encourage women to report this crime and protect them from being traumatised in the process. But the tilting of the justice system to favour victims has gone too far, grossly undermining the presumption of innocence for accused men. Now, almost all sexual complaints are being pushed through to court. All you need is the complainant's statement, and that's enough. You don't need any other evidence. No proper police investigations to see if there's anything to contradict a woman's story. Remember the Sofronoff inquiry? I'm sure most people here know all about that, where the prosecutor, Shane Drumgold, behaviour was being investigated in relation to the Brittany Higgins case. Here we had one of Australia's most prominent rape cases. The police investigation determined that Higgins was evasive, uncooperative and manipulative, and advised that the accused man, Bruce Lehrman, should not be charged. And yet here we have this zealot, this prosecutor, Drumgold, who ignored that advice, who pushed the case through to court. He withheld critical evidence. He jumped through all sorts of hopes to try to get Bruce convicted. And that's par for the course. We have police everywhere who have complained to me that they aren't allowed to properly investigate cases. One of our Mothers of Sons group was a woman who, in Queensland, whose son was accused on his 18th birthday. The girl's story fell apart in court when it was revealed the police had evidence that she had DNA evidence from 2 men in her vagina and not from the accused man. And when that family left the court after the boy was exonerated, the jury stood applauding them. They were so shocked at what that boy had been through. So this is what's happening across the country. And many of these cases still do fail in court, thank goodness, because of our decent juries. Margaret Caneen, who's one of our great Sydney barristers, she spoke a few years ago at the Rule of Law Institute, and she talked about the fact that this high failure rate actually suits the activists because they can constantly turn around and say, these cases are all failing, this means our system is not working, and therefore we need to reform the justice system further. I mean, isn't that just brilliant? You shove all these lousy cases through, they get thrown out, and then you can say, oh, well, we need a whole different system to deal with this issue. And what they also do is claim low conviction rates by expanding the number of women who claim to be sexually assaulted. So when we're talking about rape now, or sexual assault, we're now including any sexual act involving force or coercion, including attempts to force someone into sexual activity, as well as any sex involving alcohol. Our Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, who's a total feminist lapdog, has set up a new law reform commission inquiry into further reforms of sexual assault laws, which are including the possibility of lowering the standard of proof and even floating the idea of an alternate system for adjudicating rape. He wants to take all rape cases out of our current system, like kangaroo courts. The kangaroo courts we already have in all our universities, where secretive committees make decisions that have no oversight, which fail to protect the legal rights of accused men. They would love to do this for all sexual assault cases. Remember, Brittany Higgins thanked Justice Michael Lee for his trauma-informed approach in relation to the defamation action where he found Bruce Lehrman guilty of rape on the balance of probabilities, a most extraordinary decision. Trauma-informed justice is the other big feminist push. What this means is that behaviour which makes the complainant appear less credible or reliable is interpreted as proof that she was traumatised by the rape. Really clever, this one. So what we found with Lee is he ignored Higgins' false claims, for instance, that she'd seen doctors after the alleged rape. That was because she was traumatised. He also bought into her claim that she was unable to resist due to a freeze response, a log-like state. The feminists call this tonic immobility. It's based on really dubious, flawed science. But that rubbish is being taught in our justice system, being taught in the bench books, as if gospel to judges and magistrates. And Lee happily promoted it in his judgment. Yet there's absolutely zero interest in male physiological responses which could have bearing on rape cases, like men's capacity for instantaneous response to revoke consent. I recently published an article by a doctor and an expert in human factors science, and he discussed some of the absurd legal judgments which assume that men can instantly respond when a woman revokes consent, no matter how ambiguous or confusing the way she conveys that to him. Now, classic to me was the blind man. There was a case involving a blind man who's set upon by a group of nasty little 7-year-old girls. And one of the girls takes down his pants and puts her penis in his mouth. And he was charged with sexual assault for failing to immediately withdraw. I mean, can you imagine if you had all those little you realise what was happening and you have all these little teeth surrounding your precious willy? I mean, most men would freeze, wouldn't they? But the judge wasn't buying any of it. He was convicted. So none of this matters. They're not remotely interested in the male point of view in all of this, in the relentless drive to send more men to prison. And feminists and their media cheer squad are utterly shameless in pursuit of this objective. Boy, are they doing a good job. You're going to see a slide here, which is a very interesting slide, showing the huge increase. Have you found that? Yep, coming. Showing the huge increase in the last 5 years of New South Wales men imprisoned on remand. That means they haven't even faced a trial. They're in prison often for months, sometimes on years on end, without a proper trial. And look here, what you can see here, normally the number of unsentenced men in custody has nationally, the number of unsentenced men in custody has almost doubled, reaching 16,000 in the past decade. And it's, as you can see here, almost all due to the crimes feminists are targeting: sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, etc. They make up 98% in remand prisoners. Feminists are doing a brilliant job locking up men without a trial. See that now I've got another graph coming now, which is going to show the sexual assault cases reported to police in New South Wales. And these have increased 30% in the last 5 years. Now, have a look at, can you see early 2021? That's the Brittany Higgins wannabe spike. Isn't that amazing? All these women wanting a touch of Brittany's fame and maybe fortune. Now, I mentioned earlier that New South Wales is holding an audit currently of all sexual assault cases, and it'd be really nice to think this could be leading to some reform. But don't hold your breath. In Britain, they had a similar audit of these sort of cases some years ago as a result of a series of prominent rape cases which fell apart due to it being discovered that police and prosecutors were withholding key evidence. Usually we're talking about mobile phone evidence, which often is the one way a man can produce information that could exonerate him. So they had this audit, and after that there was a report published which was scathing about the fact that prosecutors routinely withhold evidence from defence, as Jumgold did in the Higgins case. Prosecutors must always act in the interests of justice and not solely for the purpose of obtaining a conviction, said the report. Tell that to our prosecutors. But unfortunately, the UK inquiry and all the discussion around it turned out to be all window dressing. UK feminists were quickly on the march again, demanding more men be sent to prison, and that they had a new campaign to get phone evidence not being allowed to be admitted in these cases. Sexual assault and domestic violence are the twin pillars of the feminist crusade to destroy men. I'm not going to say too much about domestic violence because we've got two other speakers on this really important topic. I just want to briefly say that there's very good reason why domestic violence is such a powerful lobbying tool for the feminist movement. Protecting women from dangerous men is vital. We'd all agree with that. It's an absolute motherhood issue. And we're all prepared to do what it takes to make this happen. But feminists are grossly misrepresenting the real risks here. When most people think of domestic violence, they're usually thinking about physical abuse. And yet our official ABS statistics show that 0.6 of women were physically abused by their cohabiting partner or ex-partner in 2021-22. That's the most recent data. That figure you won't see if you just browse through the statistics because it's buried in a table, of course, and never promoted. But it's blessedly small. And what we hear all the time is we're bombarded with these huge numbers which come from expanding the envelope to include emotional abuse, financial abuse, even threats of abuse. Saying there's an epidemic of domestic violence in this country is a gross deception and an utter insult to the bulk of decent, safe Australian men. But domestic violence proved absolutely critical because it became the feminist cash cow. You may know about Erin Pizzey, very famous woman. She was the first person in Britain to set up a refuge for women, and she quickly discovered when all the women moved into the refuge, she had a problem with violent women who are aggressive towards their partners or to their children. And she started to speak out about this. She was also a victim of violence from her mother, so she knew about violent women. And when she spoke out about it, the feminists took her out. She had death threats, her dog was killed, she had to leave Britain, and the refuges that she'd set up were taken over by the women's movement because they realised they were starting to get real funding, including government funding. And Pizzy's been talking for half a century about what happened to her and about how this led to this establishment of this enormous source of income for feminists across the world who manipulate domestic violence to attract funding. It's just an amazing story. And Australia is an absolute world leader when it comes to manipulation of domestic violence in order to fund an army of femocrats. We were very excited recently. There's an organisation called Our Watch, which is one of the key centres of the domestic violence industry in Australia. And they've always admitted they're using domestic violence to remake society. They have very big goals. It's all about redistribution of power between men and women. And they push the narrative, of course, that only men are violent, that tackling domestic violence requires teaching respect for women, shaming men for their misogynist attitudes. They never mention the real triggers for domestic violence, like drug and alcohol abuse, a mental illness, poverty, a background in a violent family. And they never mention that we have 50 years of research showing that women are just as likely as men to initiate, or even more likely to initiate domestic violence or perpetrate domestic violence. Anyway, with what we noticed recently, some of the key players, the two key players in the domestic violence industry, Jess Hill and Michael Slater, recently announced that shaming boys and men wasn't working. They weren't succeeding in changing attitudes. And what I loved, they gave an example of the failure to change attitudes, the fact that there was a survey showing 41% of Australians believe domestic violence is committed equally by men and women. Yay! I mean, I was terribly excited by that because I like to think I had a little bit of a role in instilling that common sense into our community. But what's happened is the Albanese government set up a new expert panel to review domestic violence policies, and it's business as usual. Even Hill and Slater are on the panel, but they've just announced they're going to keep shaming boys in our schools and men in our workplaces. There are far too many people employed by this industry to allow change to the narrative. And they're constantly, of course, expanding the definition to make sure the numbers stay up there. Last year they had a big push on financial abuse, and they got the banks to line up to say that they would freeze the accounts of people who were accused of financial abuse. And now they've got coercive control, which is already law in New South Wales and soon in Queensland. Now that's a manufactured problem cooked up by an American feminist not so long ago, describing vague behaviours that are impossible to prove, possible to define, let alone prove. We have a spoof video on the Mothers and Sons website, which is all about what we're talking about here, right? And we have an example here. She's a housewife spruiking this new product. New coercive control. Get your man sent to jail with new coercive control. He won't buy you a new kitchen. That's coercive control. He keeps badgering you for sex. That's coercive control, right? Now we're going to give a lucky door prize, and we're going to give one of these to the person who finds the sticker. I'll tell you about that later, right? And we have some spare bottles if you think you've got a use for them, right? The amazing thing about coercive control is when it was passed in New South Wales, they suddenly panicked and put the whole thing on hold for a year because they were worried about women being misidentified as perpetrators. I mean, isn't that wonderful? And what they did is send out, they're pouring women into police stations all over the country to make sure only men are charged. It's just, coercive control is a brilliant example of the skills of our feminists. The most cynical ploy I've ever come across was the fact that do you know that there's a really tragic case, the Hannah Clark murder, where a woman and her children were killed by her partner, and the feminists persuaded the grieving grandparents of this family that this homicide would never have happened if coercive control laws had been in place. And these poor grandparents were paraded around the country to promote these laws. Incredible. Right. Okay, I'm going to move on quickly. So coercive control is coming to a police station near you. Be warned. And it's going to end up with even more men in jail. We're already world leaders when it comes to false accusations of domestic violence. There was a YouGov survey last year which found Australia was had the second highest rate of false allegations in the world, usually associated with custody disputes, and that's going to get much worse. I'm sure you know that last year the Albanese government pushed through changes to the family law system. We had a world-leading family law system which was enshrined children's rights to have two parents in their life after divorce. All mentions of children's right to have care by their dads was taken out last year by Labor government. And what Albanese just announced that they're going to now, well, I suppose it was Dreyfus, they've announced they're going to also give more assets to women who are victims of domestic violence. So it goes on day after day, and our media turns a blind eye. Even our pathetic conservative media, like the Australian and Sky News, who bang on about identity politics and free speech, they never touch feminism. They won't ever let me on their programs or in their paper anymore. And it just drives me hopping mad. Australian men are getting screwed in every way except the way they'd really like. Tomorrow is Father's Day, and I think we owe it to the great dads in this country to do more to protect their relationship with their children. And I'm so glad you all came along today to learn about what's happening to men in this country, and I want you to work with me to change things. Thank you. There's a sticker on it. The sticker's on the back of their seat, the winner of the ball club.
Oh, okay. Thanks very much, Bettina. That remand graph is absolutely terrifying, isn't it? All the crime being committed in the community, and 2% of prisoners, male prisoners in jail, are represented by all those groups. The rest of it is all related to domestic complaints, and it's just terrifying, frankly.